Hey everybody, I'm Mishan Funk. Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm joined by a really awesome special guest. He's a civil engineer based out of Southern California. He is also the nephew of legendary comic book artist Steve Ditko, who co-created characters like Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, the Creeper, The Question, Captain Atom, Blue Beetle, and my favorite character, Squirrel Girl, among many others. Mr. Mark S. Ditko, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be here.
You've done quite a few interviews recently, right? So this should probably feel really natural at this point.
You know what? I always feel natural talking about my uncle because it's this. I mean, he's been a part of my life forever. So it's not something. It's almost like, can I talk about my dad or my sister or my brother or whatever? Yeah, probably endlessly, just because I've kind of grew up with them. So
just for those watching and for those who aren't familiar with Steve Ditko, there isn't that much about him like out in the public if you aren't a comic book fan, right? Like, because he's not kind of out there like, say, Stan Lee. Can you maybe talk about your relationship to him and how you would describe him to somebody who is not a comic book fan?
That's kind of a tricky question because I have only, going back, I've only ever seen him through the eyes of a family member. So to me, he was just family. It's like, your parents or your dad had an occupation and he had a business, but he was your dad, so it's like how you describe him is through a different lens,
Yeah.
So, when someone, I'll say it's usually the reverse of that. I'm in the supermarket or I'm shopping somewhere and they find out who I am and they go, oh my gosh, you're Steve Ditko's nephew. And they already know all about him. So I'm not having to describe anything. So it's usually the reverse of that. But you know what? He was a family member. So number one, I just saw him as a family member. He was my uncle. And when I grew up, all of my family members, I mean, I'll say we were all pretty close. As when I was a kid, we would always get together. All the families, probably traditional stuff, this is like old school world when all the relatives would get together for the birthdays or whatever the event, 4th of July, all those events. And we'd have a barbecue and we'd all be playing games or goofing around. Well, everybody was there. So it was just family. So my first, sort of thought of my uncle is that he was a family member. Now, if I was bumping into some comic nerd, it's like, that doesn't mean anything, to anybody. Secondly, I think for me personally, and it started when I was a late teen, I started to see him more as a philosopher. He became a bit of a guru to me just because of his, he was so open about and available about his point of view on things, life, whatever it was. So number two, to me, he was a philosopher. So I do see him through my own lens of a family member and a philosopher. And then obviously I dig deeper into the comic industry and I've started to go to comic conventions in the 90s and I started to write to him about comics and what he was doing and followed his career and did more that way. But that was really a kind of a third level or third layer of him that I got sort of engaged with. And that was, I don't want to say, it wasn't forced, it was intentional on my part. It wasn't natural in our family because when I grew up, when he would come in, well, okay, as a kid, he was just always around. I didn't know he lived in New York. He was there for barbecues like everybody else. He was there for Christmas and he was there for different events. I had no idea that he was coming in. I'm 4 or 5 years old. He's just my relatives appear when our events happen.
Right. He's just another relative.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, really to kind of get back to your point, how would I describe him, to somebody else?
Mm-hmm.
If it was really, if I was sort of pushing the comic side of him, I would just say he was a fantastic artist and industry creator in the comic business, and was really a catalyst and helped start Marvel, and eventually just continued to do that for the rest of his life.
Tell me what he was like during Thanksgiving.
All my uncles were just sort of, I don't know, I say very engaging in the family. So one of my uncles was he was always doing magic tricks, or something. So everybody had kind of like their own thing, It's like, ooh, he's the magician uncle, whatever. And Uncle Steve was just a fun uncle. When we were kids, he would wrestle with us, as he would draw pictures for us, if we asked him. He would give my older brother lessons on drawing. Or as I got older, we went out in the backyard and he taught me how to throw hatchets and knives, so it was just uncle stuff, just fun goofing around. He's flipping burgers while we're playing on the street with all the cousins.
That's amazing. And part of the reason why I asked that specific question was that was actually a fan question from a guy named Will Murray. I don't know if that name sounds familiar.
I know him.
Yeah. So to backtrack, let me explain to those who will be watching. I interviewed Will Murray, who's the co-creator of Squirrel Girl and your Uncle Steve. And you had commented on that video saying that you enjoyed the Ditko section. And I almost thought it was a spam comment, like a bot had mentioned that, because I couldn't believe that, the name Ditko is not very common. It's very unique. So naturally I jumped to, is he related to the Steve Ditko? And of course you were, and that's kind of how we got connected. But yeah, that was a question from him, which is why I asked that. So it was very, I kind of just said, hey, what would you want to know?
I mean, I have to say, one of my, the supermarket, for some reason, that I might wear a Spider-Man shirt, or I might wear something, and I might get a question, and then I say who I am, is like, oh my gosh. But there was one time I moved to Los Angeles in 90, probably, I think it was 91. And I was grocery shopping, and I looked across the street and there was a yard sale, and I saw some comic boxes, and I was kind of out of it for a while. I mean, I had gotten married, 5-6 years earlier. I had, 2 kids. I'm just, just starting my life in Los Angeles. And I got distracted from the whole comic side. I wasn't really involved in it, engaged. But I saw this yard sale across the street, and there were some comic boxes. I thought, I got to go over there and browse around. So I go over there and I start like looking through the boxes and seeing some stuff. And I just happened to ask, maybe it's a loaded question, hey, you have any Ditko? So we start talking. He finds out who I am, and he was like, oh my gosh, okay, come here, I got to show you something. So he takes me down into, it was an apartment complex. He takes me down into the basement garage where all the cars are parked. And he's got 2 giant trunks full of comics. Apparently, maybe he had a comic shop or something at one point, or maybe, I don't know, maybe it was just a collector. I don't know. But he had 2 giant trunks full of comics. And he says, I know I got some Ditko in there. I'd have to go through them. So he said, you know what? Because of who you are, I'll sell you both these trunks for $200. And I was like, I'm in.
That's the friends.
I went home,
right?
Yeah. I got my truck and loaded up these 2 trunks full of comics and took them home. And that kind of was a pretty big catalyst for me to just shove my face back into the career and get kind of interested again.
Yeah. Do you normally get that kind of treatment when you go to comic shops, or I don't know if you go to conventions very often?
Yeah. When I go to comic shops, if I say who I am, or if I buy something and on my credit card it says Mark Ditko, usually I'll kind of get that. And then I'll admit, I get a little bit of a royal treatment. But when I so I started going to comic conventions in 91, 92, 93, 94. And yeah, I have to say that name goes a long way.
I'm sure.
Because it just they roll out the red carpet. I've met Jack Kirby multiple times. I get right in to see Stan Lee. I'm talking to Jim Shooter. Just everybody just kind of was pretty wide open arms. And John Romita and Neil Adams. I see all these guys now, and obviously whoever's still around. And I'm definitely embraced by the industry just because of who I am. So
Mhm.
yeah, I'd say Michael will probably hate that, that I'm sort of like glomming off of his career and having doors open for me because of who I am. But you know what? I love that guy. He was so good, and other people knew it too. So I love chatting about the biz.
And you were talking about, you meeting other creators. Have there been any like talks of connecting with other descendants of other comic creators? Because I know there's like, Jeremy Kirby, who's like the grandson of Jack Kirby. There's Dorian Sinnott, the grandson of Joe. They are also advocates of their relatives' legacy and their work. So do you have like a club of just like all the descendants of these?
I would love that, because and I guess my first sort of taste of that was after Stan passed away, they did a tribute down in Hollywood in front of Grauman's, and Michael Uslan, invited me and my sister and my other brother up on stage with Jeremy Kirby, and I guess
Okay.
there's one of the other Kirbys. So I met him there. But that was the only time I really bumped into him. But it's something I you know what, I have my own business, and I'm kind of so engaged in kind of trying to do more stuff with the Ditko stuff that I feel like I'm so at full saturation with where I'm going that starting like kind of a side club of relatives is probably like lower on my list.
Yeah,
although
yeah.
I love to just, I'll tell you who I want to get a hold of is I like to get a hold of Eric Stanton's daughter. Apparently she's out here in LA. So I mean, I have some interest in getting a hold of some people. I just haven't really gotten around to doing it yet.
What do you think is the most frequently asked question that people ask you about Steve?
I would probably say it was something along the lines of like this mythical, was he really a recluse and basically an odd character, it's probably along those lines is what most people kind of are sort of mired down in. Whoever didn't really know him, they're sort of encumbered by this stereotypical kind of a view of who he was.
Right.
That's probably if there was something, it was probably along those lines.
Yeah, I think that's the like a big misconception, right? That he was like this curmudgeon, this grumpy guy who didn't want to talk to anybody. Would you also say that was like that's a big misconception? Like that couldn't be far from the truth.
You know what? So I think about this. I think about this stuff a lot because I'm re-engaging in all this stuff, and I'm reading hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles. Everybody that writes anything about him, from books to plays to whatever, I want to read all this stuff. Plus, I wrote back and forth with him, for decades. Ever since when I started going back to comic conventions in 1991, that's when he and I started to write, more, back and forth on a more regular basis. But I think about him all the time, and that's something that he's he is so not that. In fact, I go one step further to go, boy, I'll tell you why that makes sense, why someone would have that attitude. If you created a character 40 years ago and everybody that wrote to you said, hey, Mark, do you remember back in 1971 when you created that one character and you worked on that for, a year or so? Why aren't you there still? How come you left that? And then all of a sudden you get this, not a couple times, you've got this like for the 7,000th time. It's like at some point you go, oh my God, people, like move on with your lives. You'd start to have this kind of attitude, in a way. I mean, it's kind of almost like, how much of a beating can you take about what you did? It doesn't matter what you did in the past 20, 30 years. It's something that you did. This is the one-hit wonders, they think you're a one-hit wonder when you've been in the business for 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
So I think that to me is a heck of a justification for being a little bit like curt with someone who says, draw me Spider-Man. You know, he was the best. It's like, yeah, you and 10,000 other people.
Right. Do you think I don't know if I don't know how much he opened to you, but do you think like there are days where he regrets coming up with Spider-Man? Like, do you feel like that is like something that he would take back if he could, knowing that it would just like follow him for the rest of his life?
No, no, yeah, that's where you have to understand who he is. And the thing is that he had such a philosophical grounding, which is what attracted me, and it kind of kept, that was the foundation of our relationship. You know, he had such a strong philosophical grounding that he was a rock. You know, when he made a decision and he was moving forward with something, you know what, in fact, I was reading a couple quotes, and there was this one I thought was really interesting, that he says, let me just find this. Oh,
Yeah.
he says, it was in an essay that he wrote. He said, like Sinatra, I have few regrets. And he really never expressed that kind of thing to me. So he had very few, but this one I thought was really interesting. He said, like Sinatra, I have few regrets. I always regretted that I threw away the Kirby pages on his creation of Spider-Man. I could have and should have had those pages photostated. So that I kind of ran across. It was just like that, and he says he has very few regrets. And in all of my dealings with him, he was a forward momentum, future looking guy. He didn't care about what he did. Look how the industry goes. You do some artwork. When does it get published? Not tomorrow, not in the next hour. It sometimes doesn't hit the streets for months. Right. Well, what are you doing? Sitting around waiting for that thing to come out for a couple months so you can get some kudos? No, dude, you got to get a paycheck, man. You're on the next job. So he was built by his industry to just sort of drive himself forward, keep the machine going. But philosophically, he didn't think about the past. He was a visionary, and visionaries live in the future. And that was truly who he was. He didn't have that kind of baggage. He wasn't dragging stuff behind him. And as a family member, that was that other bond. And then come to find out, and I probably didn't find out till, in fact, I've had other people ask me that, and it's such a blur, which in my mind, it's because it was insignificant when I found out. It wasn't like, do you remember the day that you got that car? It's like, totally. It's like, absolutely. I remember that. It's like, that was a light bulb blitz, switch moment. But when I found out what he had done, it was just kind of like, oh, wow, cool. That's pretty amazing. I mean, it really is. That's really something. And I will never forget that, but it wasn't something that really colored something, or it was so jaw-droppingly memorable that I remember when I was 14, after my that birthday, that I saw the Spider-Man in Steve Ditko name. It wasn't like that.
Yeah. You mentioned that you wrote to him quite a bit, and there's a Facebook page dedicated to these Steve Ditko letters, right? Like, for someone who was considered a recluse and didn't like people, he wrote to people a lot. How aware are you of these letters? And do you know when did he always do that? Was that always something he did because he liked talking and hearing from fans?
You know what? He's old school in a way that, what did you do in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s when you're off into the military and whatever? Everybody wrote letters. Mm-hmm. That's what people did. They didn't have email. I mean, even picking up a phone wasn't something you necessarily did. That was like a special thing, got a phone call,
Yeah.
But it was letters. So he comes from that era. So that was something that was, to him, very natural, and the way that he loved to correspond. He loved to get the letter, be able to digest it, maybe make some notes or something, and then eventually formulate a good response that was, very appropriate and not missing any points, and then send back a letter. So plus he could do that in his own time.
Right.
So he did that. In fact, I would guess. Okay, he and I wrote back and forth since 90. I know others that wrote him probably from around that same time period, and they wrote every single week up until he passed away. So, and then when we went to his studio to clean it out, the mail slot was about 18 inches off the floor or whatever, and they had been just pushing mail in there. We couldn't even just freely open the door because there was so much mail packed behind it.
Wow.
And there were probably, in the couple months that he wasn't in his studio, because he was probably he was in the hospital, then he was in his apartment. But the couple months that he wasn't in his studio, there were probably 150 letters just in those couple months. And they weren't letters, oh, condolences, whatever. They were letters that he had people who he had been writing to, and or people who are writing him new letters. I wouldn't be surprised if he wrote 750 letters a year or 1,000 letters a year. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, look, you see that stuff on the Steve Ditko letters page, you know, people posting that stuff. Those are the people that post them that are aware of, you know, that page, and that happen to be on Facebook and happen to be engaged in that group. So he wrote just so much, volumes and volumes.
Do you recall sort of some of the last conversations, whether it was verbal or through letters, that you remember with him?
No, in fact, someone else asked me that question, and I probably need to just go through my letters to see, you know, what our last correspondence was. But the one to me that was a little bit more memorable was just when I went back. Last time I saw him was 2005, and we went back to Johnstown. That was that video. I posted it on the Steve Ditko's World, that I run, and there was that video that my daughter took with no sound because she had it on fast forward. But she took that little clip. So that was the last time I had spent any time with him. But the conversations, I mean, boy, if there was something that I just absolutely just dug out of my skull, was just having conversations with him, because it was almost like, I guess with me too, the conversation is no holds barred. It's whatever you want to talk about. And if for some reason you have some reluctance to say something, then, you know, maybe you say, yeah, I don't really feel like talking about that. But we talked about everything from, you know, government, philosophy, you know, bees, you know, just joking stuff, you know, just everything from, and he was just so funny. I mean, oh my gosh, he was so funny. He had some real humor behind him, you know, inside of him. So yeah, to me, the last thing that's really more memorable was the last time I went and saw him in 2005.
What projects are you doing to ensure that people either remember or are aware of his achievements?
Well, you know, everything was handed down to my dad, and the basically, because he wasn't married, it went down to the siblings. And it's really, you know, my uncle's family was, you know, my dad, my Aunt Annie, and my Aunt Betty. So basically everything got handed down to those third to those families. So I'm just sort of a tear down, you know, from my dad. I just have a personal interest in my uncle because I've love him and I've followed his career maybe more than others have. But I just feel like he needs to be more recognized and made aware. I mean, you said it, there was not a lot of, maybe there should have been more people who were aware that he had passed away and what his you know, contributions were in the industry. So when he first passed away, when I went home, my dad, this is one project that we've kind of have moving forward. My dad said we should do a book, and he just kind of working title, he said we should do a book called Steve Ditko the Man. Who Steve Ditko was as a brother, as a son, as a uncle, you know, so just as a family member and as a friend. So one of the things that we have going on now, which will probably be released in 2022, is a book about my Uncle Steve as a brother. All the relatives and friends have kind of written up, sections or contributed in some way, stories, but not from an industry perspective. Although there's some industry people, but they're talking about him from a friend perspective, from a person perspective, not industry side. So that's going to come out, and with that is going to be a lot of never seen before photos and memorabilia and stuff that he had. So that's one thing that is in the works. I read the draft about a month ago, so that's moving forward. I think to me this is just sort of the tip of the iceberg, because I think we would have never done any of this stuff while he was alive. He didn't want it.
Yeah.
So now, and I think Matt, who really kind of coordinated all this stuff at the Bottle Works, he was talking to my dad, and my dad said, he was behind this show as long as the intention is just to show who he was as a family member, as a person, as opposed to just trying to, color it somehow in some other distorted way. He just wants the truth out there. Yeah. So my dad and, the family pretty much supports it, just to the degree it paints him in the correct light. And that's pretty much what I kind of feel like one of my roles is, based on my understanding of my uncle, is to be able to be the kind of a philosophical monitor, of things. Yeah. When I got, David Curry gave me his manuscript of his book, Zach Cruz gave me his, Lenny, when he put the Ditko play together, he sent me the whole screenplay before they even did it. I read all this stuff, man, multiple times, and I give back serious comments,
right?
Because I'm just like, yo, you can't say that way.
Yeah.
I am
that's not true. That is not, that's not.
Oh, it's just, even if it puts a slightly different skew on it, it was just like, no, you can't say that, because it's too distorting. It's too, so yeah, I'm definitely a little fanatical Ditko philosophical monitor editor of things. I like to see that. In fact, there was somebody who wrote a book that wouldn't take my comments. And I was like, okay, we're not associated with that. Then. Right. I don't want any connection to that book at all. So yeah, we're doing everything that we can to put his real life out there more. And I'll say we're really just getting started. The family kind of, I was all hot to trot when, from the beginning. I kind of feel like, to a certain degree, I've been kind of holding myself back, just because, the rest of the family has to kind of get their head wrapped around all this,
If you could cast an actor to play Steve Ditko in a movie, if they were to make one, who do you think would be a good?
Keanu Reeves. No.
Oh, I actually thought you were serious for a second. That would have been interesting.
No, I want Keanu Reeves to play Mr. A.
Oh, that'd be, I like that. I like that a lot, actually.
I don't know. I never really thought about that, it's probably getting way ahead of it. But what I would say relative to that is, if we do a documentary, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I would really, really want to be involved. I would not want to just let someone do what they want to do to their own devices. At the last Spider-Man premiere down in Hollywood, after the movie, I was talking to Kevin Feige, and we're just chatting, and he's asked me about the kind of the tribute, that he did at the end with the Steve Ditko and Stan Lee kind of signature and stuff. And he says, what I think about that. And I was like, that was okay, but he said he really wanted to do a lot more. He wanted to make something a little more elaborate, but he didn't have any material. So then I was telling him, yeah, we're trying to get out more material. We're trying to get more information out so that you could kind of paint a better picture of who he was. And he said, you have to do that, because if you don't do it, somebody else will, or what will happen 10 years from now, the only thing that will be left is a caricature of who he was. And you'll just be a cartoon kind of thing of a recluse, cranky old recluse, something with his head down on the board and drawing, in, a bubble. So, it's really true. And that's kind of what part of my motivation is I want people should know who he really was, and not some speculative kind of innuendos because of a bunch of people who wrote to him one letter or didn't really even know him, and they kind of think that they do know him. So I'm definitely on a mission, and it's not an inexpensive mission to just get his name out there more. I mean, I'm just this right now, it's a money pit, but you know what, I'm on a mission. I just want to get his name out there, and I want to do right by him.
You should consider maybe Disney Plus as the platform.
There's chatter.
That's exciting. I'm looking forward to whatever it is that comes out that you are involved in. We've been talking for an hour. I appreciate you being here. If you could say one thing to the fans of Steve Ditko, what would you say to them?
Stay tuned. I mean, you know what? He was who he was. And you know what? I think our book is going to go a long way. So I can't say there's nothing that I would just go, oh my God, you never knew this. I would really go back to, he wrote a small series of essays on some of the earlier Spider-Man books. Have you ever seen those?
No.
Yeah, it was his like comic history series. And he wrote from notes that he had on some of the early issues of Spider-Man, what he had developed, what he had suggested, what Stan said. Another project that I have going on, that my wife has spent a lot of time on, is I'm trying to collect all of his writings in one volume of all of his essays. To me, that's something that where he says, hey, he's known by his works. Well, hey, if he wrote it, it's straight from the horse's mouth.
Right.
So you should really kind of hunt down those. If you really want to get a little insight, find those essays that he wrote on the early issues of Spider-Man.
And it's did you mention the title, right? Or you mentioned what they were called?
You know what? I'd have to dig. I'll email you.
Yeah,
I'll find, because I have them in my kind of my list of catalog of all of his essays. He put it out probably with Robin Snyder in his comic, magazine, his newsletter he puts out. So they were probably published in there. But I'll get you. In fact, I don't know. I'll see if I have them scanned or something like that. I'll send them to you. But to me, those are that's deep insight that most people aren't aware of, because who the heck saw those except maybe the couple hundred people that get Robin's newsletter.
I have no more questions. That's pretty much everything I wanted to know. I feel like I've gotten to know him on a very different level, and I appreciate your time. And I would love to have you back again once you have some of those projects up and running.
I'd love to come back. You know what? I could go on for, you said we were so far into this hours. I was just getting started. So, I mean, I could do an 8-hour interview probably, but so we'll end it off here, and until next time.